Thank you, John, for tearing this down. And thanks to all of y'all, I'm from Atlanta, for listening and thinking through these issues with us. It has been such a fun day, to put it overly lightly. It's an incredibly provocative day, so I really appreciate it. My paper is about community building and community organizing, sort of maybe the more traditional sense. I loved that Duncan talked about community building in terms of the way that a school board might do it. In the context of the community that I study, in a certain way, school board members are a bit of the enemy. They're sort of the neoliberal cheerleaders, imagining that certain kinds of reforms are the way forward and are going to bring enormous change and prosperity to the city and to the students, the white affluent students. So I'm sort of trying to think about here how community building at the level of the parents, the families, and the community members is possibly in dialogue with these broader ways of resisting the neoliberalization of education. So that said, thank you all three of you for the wonderful introduction to Canadian education politics. That was wonderful. So I want to begin by saying progressive American academics, US academics, myself included, talk all the time about race and poverty in public schools. This is one of our obsessions. We've nearly worn ourselves out with talking, and yet the situation of low-income children of color, the children that I work with in the community I study outside Atlanta, and where I did this ethnographic work, the situation of low-income children of color in U.S. schools is only becoming more dire. Schools across the U.S. South and West are rapidly resegregating. Schools in the Northeast really never desegregated dramatically. Across the country, numbers of low-income immigrant children and poor children of color continue to rise in our public school systems. Low-income parents and children of color are increasingly disfranchised by education reforms that frame them as consumers in a market that offers the greatest choice, advantage, and privilege to affluent buyers. Privatization, neoliberalization, and for-profit companies meet increasingly warm receptions at the local and federal levels, and market-oriented reforms such as charter schools, which often serve investing corporations much better than they serve children, garner the support of the most powerful philanthropists and businesses in the U.S. Familiar faces. This is all to say, our talk must now turn to action. This paper grapples with what shape that action takes in Marietta, Georgia, a community that, like many others, where school leaders and city leaders are responding with free market solutions to rising inequality and resegregation of the schools. So the question I'm most concerned with, and both in Marietta, the suburb of Atlanta where I do my work, and more broadly when it comes to educational justice, is the impact of neoliberalization on community. And as Duncan pointed out, the way that we think about and define community is ever in flux and in dialogue with structural problems, right? And negotiations of power. So I'm thinking about community really specifically in this local sense, but I'm also talking about community as an idea that we engage with when we try to think about what liberation is in the classroom and more broadly. So this paper grapples with what shape action takes in Marietta, Georgia, and what the increasing neoliberalization of education and the marginalization of students of color and immigrants do to the relationship between communities and schools. So, how is the redefining and mobilizing of the community a powerful antidote to free market ideologies and education policies that degrade the public sphere and undermine the bonds of community? While my discussion is about one high school in one city, it is also about schools as sites for social change. As one of the panelists before put it, schools are sites where schooling happens, but schools are also critical sites of social struggle. It is about school-based community building as a powerful resistance to discourses and neoliberal policies that fracture the relationship between community and school and that increasingly deny low-income children of color opportunity and educational justice. And of course, we've seen resistance across the U.S. In terms of massive demonstrations to protest school closures, especially the school closures in Chicago and the school closures in Philly. So this is community resistance in the form of major protest actions. So my work is about Marietta High, located about 20 miles from Atlanta. It has about a 2,000 plus student population, 72% of which is minority, and we sort of narrowly frame it in the U.S. South, minority as African American and Latino. Thank you. 60% of the student population at the high school I study is low income. So, what I want to talk about is community gardening as a site of resistance to the neoliberalization of education. The political climate in Georgia is a toxic one for undocumented students, and undocumented students are a growing population in this community I study. MEET, the organization that I'm talking about today, stands for Mentoring, Empowering, and Educating for Tomorrow. It began as an exclusively school-based club in 2008 and then became a nonprofit. I argue that MEET expands the very definition of community. Who comprises MEET, where it is based, and what it seeks to accomplish challenge traditional definitions of school community. It convenes once a week after school, and high schoolers and elementary schoolers are paired in mentoring, academic mentoring relationships, but also to execute service projects in the community where they live, which is the poorest community in Marietta, and that's called Franklin Road. So I argue that in the rhetoric of school leaders, the school community refers specifically to staff, faculty, and students. But however, in the context of the work of this group, the community building work of this group, community becomes inclusive of the city's poor, jobless, ill, and undocumented. Organizing community and community building in this broader comunidad is a form of resistance to the discourses and policies that posit the poor and undocumented of Franklin Road as outside the embrace of citizenship. So service to Franklin Road is the centerpiece of this organization. The projects are planned and executed by the students, and the projects are more than sort of let's make a mural or let's plant a garden, right? Those are manifestations of the way that the organization is refusing discourses that marginalize community members and produce aliens, illegals, thugs, and criminals instead of neighbors and friends. So this is Gabby Perez, my friend and my mentor. She's a 19-year-old college kid, but she founded the community garden on Franklin Road when she was 15. When I first met Gabby, she was in the garden securing a pair of huge gloves on a pair of tiny hands. As an ongoing collaborative project of the MEET organization, students and Parkwood residents, the community garden represents an alternative vision of sustainability, of education, and of the people of Franklin Road themselves, who, as I said, are the poor people of color in the community and the undocumented people of color in the community. Among Marietta's politicians, school leaders, and residents across race and class, Franklin Road plays a particular role discursively. It's a site where narratives about the city and the schools, past and future, are constructed and contested. At the nexus of those discourses, the people of Franklin are construed as rootless and without an investment in their future and that of their community. They are framed in the local media and by city leaders as members of a blighted place which is beyond redemption. In 2013, city leadership embarked on a campaign to cultivate support for the redevelopment of Franklin Road. For the sake of our schools, claimed the mayor. And this is a fascinating chart to me, but basically it shows by apartment complex, there used to be 17 on Franklin Road, how much the city spends to educate each student. So per complex. So the city could determine which complex was the most expensive to educate these poor students of color who were framed as bringing down test scores and undesirable members of the community anyway. So this was a way of formulating the redevelopment strategy. Not very subtle, I don't think. At the news of the redevelopment, students of MEET and their community partners on Franklin Road sought to demonstrate that the complexes were sites of community building. They were orchestrating the transformation of Franklin Road into a safe and affordable neighborhood where, in the words of one of the association members, quote, people are organizing here to improve their lives. The unpredictability of work and good wages means that the poor families on Franklin Road find themselves constantly on the move. This paradox of being moved about and held in place is a signature of human struggle in the neoliberal economy. In the language of the city's politicians and school leaders, these families are transients, and the discourse of transients frames the low-income residents of Franklin as a liability for the city, tallied, as I said, in emergency room visits, fire and police department calls, and in the view of many, the defection of white and affluent families from an increasingly black, brown, and high-poverty school system. Extricating the schools from the poverty and strife on Franklin, rather than ameliorating that poverty and strife, is how the city council and how school leaders articulate the dilemma of Franklin Road. The students of Franklin know the topography of poverty in Marietta better than students anywhere else in the city. And part of that topography is, of course, an absence of fresh food, right? This area is a food desert. And so the students of MEET founded the community garden in an effort to foster, quote, a local economy, in the words of Wendell Berry, one in which interdependence, local knowledge and skills, and local production and consumption redefine the economic and social landscape. Like neoliberal education reform, the politics of development in Marietta is oriented around markets rather than communities. And I love this quote by Chad Lavin. He says, "The neoliberal's dilemma is offering private solutions and a failure to even imagine the public ones." Lavin blames the fact that so many American pundits, leaders, and citizens rely on individual or market-oriented solutions, in part on the widespread belief in this country, the United States, that political disagreement owes to differential access to information rather than to real and irresolvable conflicts over resources and opportunities. However, in places like Cuba during the peak oil crisis, in South Central Los Angeles in the fight over the huge community garden there in 2006, and in contemporary Detroit, which I have learned today shares a great number of structural and social challenges with Windsor, local people have refused private solutions and instead have organized and re-envisioned their cityscape, their communities and their economic destinies through thriving networks of community gardens, grassroots greening organizations, and youth empowerment programs. All of these dedicated to the idea of rooting their communities, quite literally, in a new era that refuses the requisitioning of their bodies, minds, and resources for a neoliberal global economy. Okay, I'm close. I'm getting close. You guys are doing great. Way to stick it out. So the question I want to ask about this kind of organizing and about the way that community building reframes struggles over resources and struggles over opportunities is that in the local context, I want to know what would happen if the poor students of color on Franklin Road were situated at the very center of local education reform. And if instead of treating students of Franklin Road like the symptoms of an illness affecting school performance, they were viewed instead as central to re-envisioning what schools do and how they do it. If they were deemed students deserving of the resources and legislative attention and community support that are comparatively lavished on the better-heeled residents elsewhere in town. Instead of kids about whom something must be done, they can be seen as students who do something, as agents of change rather than victims of it. And so, Ruth Yow offers us some insights about how we have to seek a way to form a new order in the structures of the old. And this brilliant activist, Grace Lee Boggs, has a number of wonderful things to say about transformative education. And she suggests that critically, community gardening, home rehabbing, water and soil testing, that projects that are central to community health are projects that students can engage in as a way of learning about, improving, and engaging with the major issues of their community. I mean, that is a different means of being schooled and a different way of engaging with what it means to have power, right? And of course, our friend John Dewey. Educational aims should be natural to the students' own experience rather than merely those in which they are taught to acquiesce. So I want to say finally that that in this formulation, low-income students of color are redefining community in these very transformative ways. And they practice citizenship in ways that draw school and community closer. And as they do that, the powerful grip of neoliberal reform slackens. The students in Marietta and students elsewhere doing this kind of work make it clear that community is an expanding family, that citizenship is a commitment to that community, and that education is the power to take part in realizing the deeper dignity and greater justice for the whole community at and beyond the schools.